Hi, everyone, and welcome to God's Plan, Your Part, a podcast where our goal is to read the entire Bible in a year, seeking to understand God's plan of redemption while discovering daily and practically your part in it.
Hey, everybody, welcome back to God's Plan, Your Part. Today it's just me, Ryan, and we are looking at 2 Kings 24 and 25 and 2 Chronicles 36. Basically, if you've been on this journey with us for a while, we are wrapping up today 2 Kings and 2 Chronicles. We'll finish up both of those books. The reason being that we've been reading through Jeremiah, and this is a chronological reading, so the events that have been occurring in Jeremiah are also covered in 2 Kings 24 and 25 and 2 Chronicles 36. Basically, just so you get a picture of what's going on here and how significant these couple of chapters are, God spoke to Abraham all the way back in the beginning of Genesis and told him, you don't have any children, but you're going to be the father of many nations. And that's like the first major covenant that God makes with Abraham. Abraham obviously thinks that that is crazy because he doesn't have any kids, so how could he father nations? Sarah laughs about that, but eventually they have Isaac. They make a couple mistakes along the way, but they have Isaac. We slowly capture how God is faithful to his promise because we see Abraham and Sarah's family become a bigger and bigger and bigger family. We fast forward to Jacob, who would have been Abraham's grandson. He has quite a large family. His name gets changed to Israel. One of his family members, Joseph, is sold into slavery and carried to Egypt, which seems like a very odd thing. He is serving in Egypt for quite a long time. He starts out in prison but ends in the palace. And there's a famine in the land, and the family of Jacob comes to Egypt, and Joseph is able to protect them and save them. And so Jacob's family ends up living in Egypt. Now, they end up in Egypt for 400 years because the Egyptians decide to enslave them. So at some point, the Pharaoh doesn't really appreciate Jacob's family anymore. He wants to use Jacob's family to build whatever it is he's building. And the Israelites, the people, the descendants of Jacob, the people, the descendants of Abraham, are serving in Egypt for 400 years. Then Moses comes on the scene and he leads the people out of Egypt, and they cross the Red Sea, and they miss the mark several times, and God leads them out into the wilderness so that they basically repent of their sin and of their doubt. That whole generation dies off, minus a couple of guys who were faithful, and they cross into the promised land under Joshua. Now, when they cross into the promised land, they're supposed to do what God said. They're supposed to be obedient, but they are not obedient, and they let several of the people just continue living in the promised land and worshiping all these false gods. God tells the people that this is going to be a snare to you. It is not going to be good for you to be around all these false gods because these idols are going to be tempting to you and they are going to cause you to fall. We enter into the period of Judges, and it's very dark. If you want to hear how dark it is, you can go back and listen to some of those episodes that we've done. But the period of Judges is a terrible time where everybody does what is right in their own eyes. And the stories just kind of spiral further and further and further down because the people are more and more disobedient. And eventually, the people beg for a king to unite Israel. And Saul comes on the scene, King Saul. He has everything you think a king should have, except he is not faithful to the Lord. So we watch Saul do kind of good at first and just slowly fail. And then David comes on the scene. David is a man after God's own heart. David is anointed as king. He's on the run because Saul's trying to kill him. And eventually David becomes king over all of Israel. And this is seen as a very good thing. We finally have a united kingdom of Israel that is walking out the plans that God has for them. It seems like a great time. David has some faults. He makes a couple of sins. He repents of his sins when he's confronted by the prophets. So David goes down in history as a pretty good king that united Israel. His son Solomon comes up and starts to lead Israel. The problem with Solomon is that he allows his many wives from many nations to carry his heart away from God. And when Solomon finishes up reigning, basically Israel gets split into two nations. We have the northern kingdom of Israel, the southern kingdom of Judah, and we come into this period of the split, divided kingdom in Israel, which is what we've been reading about in Kings and Chronicles. There's many kings in Israel, there's many kings in Judah, there's many prophets in Israel, there's many prophets in Judah, but the overall narrative is that the people are not obedient to the Lord. You get some bright spots here and there, but overall, the people are drawn away from the Lord. And so the northern kingdom of Israel is judged and carried into exile in 722 by the Assyrian Empire. And now today, as we're reading, we see that the kingdom of Judah is finally brought to an end in 586 when the temple is destroyed and the people are carried off into exile. All of this because they chose not to be obedient to the Lord. They chose to rebel against God. They chose to resist his plans and his purposes. They worshiped many other gods. Sometimes they continued to worship God, but also in this like greater pantheon of many gods. And so God gives them up to judgment. And what's really interesting in these readings is that Nebuchadnezzar is used as God's instrument. The Egyptians are used as God's instrument. And finally, at the end of 2 Chronicles 36, King Cyrus, the king of the Persians, is used as God's instrument. So one of the things that we see overall is that God is sovereign over all creation and all nations because he is bringing about the things that he desires. He says that he will make Abraham into a giant nation. He does exactly that. He says that if the people are disobedient, they will be carried off into exile. That's revealed in Deuteronomy through Moses. And we see here through 2 Kings and 2 Chronicles that the people have not been obedient, and so they come under the cursings of those passages in Deuteronomy, and they are carried off and they are judged. So God does that. God chooses to use Nebuchadnezzar to do that. Jeremiah has been revealing, as we've been reading through Jeremiah, that the people of the nation would be restored, that they'd be able to come back home. And we see that God moves in Cyrus's heart to allow the people of Israel and Judah to come home. Now that those nations look very different when they do come back. The temple that they build is kind of the janky, not as good as the first temple. But God moves in the hearts and the minds of many different people across the scope of this huge story to bring about what he desires. The other strange thing is that he also gives people the freedom to make choices as they go. It certainly was not God's will that the Israelites, the people of Judah, the kings, that they would be disobedient to him. So he gave them this level of choice where they could serve him or not. And consistently people fail and choose to serve other gods and move away from God. And so we see this story come to a close. What's really interesting, this is obviously not the end of the story, but it is the end of the period of time where these two kingdoms, this one kingdom of Israel, is present on the earth. Things change in a significant way. And because of that, it seems like a dark time in history. It kind of strikes people as, hey, like these were God's kings and priests. These were God's representatives. And now they've been wiped out from the face of the earth. How is God going to continue to move? And that's what's so interesting about God using Nebuchadnezzar and God using Cyrus. So I guess it's not often that I just give you like a long sweeping summary of what we've read. Basically, I was trying to cover Genesis to 2 Chronicles. But I'm hoping you get a big picture feel for what has been happening as we've been reading. I think sometimes it's good to kind of like pop our heads out of where we're reading and just see what's going on in the grander narrative. It's kind of a bummer. It's kind of a bummer that God judges these nations and these nations are utterly destroyed and carried off. So what's the takeaway from today? The takeaway is God was always in control in all of these situations. So does it seem like a dark time? Yes, it does. It definitely does. And God is still in control. That's what's so wild. And so my encouragement to you today is if you are struggling, if you are dealing with something difficult, maybe you think over the grand sweeping narrative of your life. You can remember the high times, you can remember the low times, you can remember when God was really faithful to you, when you were really faithful to God. But you can also remember, or maybe you're going through right now, a really, really difficult time, I just want to encourage you that God is still in control. And when you're obedient to God, you are walking in his will and in his plan. So if you're dealing with a difficult time in your life and you're not being obedient with God, man, he is gracious, he is merciful, he's long suffering. Repent of your sin and come back to the Lord and enjoy relationship with him. And if you're going through a difficult time and you are following the Lord, you are obedient, you're like, man, what the heck? Like I am doing what God says and still my life is hard. Remain faithful that he is in control. He sees you. He knows you. He has compassion for you. Stay faithful to him and trust that he will bring you through it. I think about what we've been reading about Jeremiah. He has gone through some very, very difficult, dark times. God said he would not be carried into exile, and then he was partially carried into exile. And all of a sudden, the people realized that he was not supposed to be with all the captives, so they let him go. So you think about what was going through his mind. I'm sure he had doubts about God. I'm sure he had frustrations about God. And yet God proved to be faithful to him. So just like God was faithful to Jeremiah, just like God was faithful to his promises, God will be faithful to you. So have faith and trust and hope in him, and he will carry you through. We'll be back again tomorrow. See you then.
Thanks so much for listening to God's Plan, Your Part. If anything stuck out to you, if you have any questions, or if you'd like to receive a Bible, you can email us at godsplanyourpart@gmail.com. Also, if you're enjoying the podcast, please consider supporting us through the link in our description. We love that you're on this journey with us, and we hope you have a great day. See you tomorrow.